stuck in mobility and poverty in divided Bengal. And the time she will cover is from 1947 to 2008, and not from 1905 to 1911, which we apply to when we talk about divided Bengal. It's a very intriguing topic, and thank you for selecting this one. We understand this is the best time to organize a public lecture of this importance and scope, because right from tomorrow we start a vacation in this university, and most people are on the move. They're going to the village, and this is of course a very busy time of the year, but we are emboldened and encouraged by your presence. I'm sure the next 1.5 hours will be a rewarding experience. The honors of chairing the lecture has fallen on me, which I consider to be an honor. My name is Syed Manzurul Islam. I'm a visiting faculty at BRAC University in the English department, which is ENH, English and Humanities, and history is a very important subject component. And the distinguished speaker tonight, Professor Chatterji, is a renowned historian with a global audience. I invite Professor Chatterji to the dais. While she takes her seat, let me explain. Yeah, please continue. Let me explain how we go about organizing the session. I will introduce Professor Chatterji, and will then invite her to speak. She has told me that she would speak for 45 minutes. And this will be followed by a question and answer session. And the Vice Chancellor, Professor Syed Saad Andalib, has agreed to conduct the Q&A session. He has a wealth of experience doing this. He will also deliver the vote of thanks. And the Q&A session will be roughly about half an hour. And we would appreciate and admire if you keep your questions very simple and precise to the point, so that in this half an hour we can accommodate as many questions as possible. Now a few words about Professor Joya Chatterji. And I'm sure most of you know her, and many of you probably took part in the workshop she conducted yesterday. Professor Chatterji teaches modern South Asian and world history at Cambridge University. The subjects she teaches include world history since 1900 and the history of the Indian subcontinent from the late 18th century to the present day. In addition, she supervises on the expansion of Europe from 1500 to the First World War. She convenes the MPhil in modern South Asian studies and teaches an option together with a colleague on the South Asian migration and diaspora. Her research interests include modern South Asian history, British imperial and world history, partition, borders, refugees and minorities, migration and diaspora, and citizenship. Professor Chatterji's doctoral dissertation explored the causes of the partition of Bengal in 1905 and India in 1947. It was published in 1995 as Bengal Divided. Anyone interested to pick up the Bengali version, which was published by UPL in 2004 under the title Bangla Bhag, Holo, you can pick it up from Aziz supermarket. She then became interested in the consequences of the partition and the accompanying migration, and wrote a book on these themes called The Spoils of Partition, which came out in 2007. Her key publications include Bengal Divided, Hindu Communalism and Partition, 1932-1947, The Spoils of Partition, Bengal and India, 1947-1967, and of course Bangla Bhag. But she also contributes to numerous journals and conducts workshops and has attended many seminars. At present, Professor Chatterji is writing a monograph on the history of South Asian citizenship and working on a general history of the South Asian 20th century. We appreciate her taking some time off from her busy lecturing and research schedule and coming here at the invitation of our Vice Chancellor. In addition to conducting a workshop, she also did, which she did yesterday, which was very well attended, and I've got very glorious reports about the workshop. I now invite her to give her lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Joya Chatterji.
Thank you. Am I audible? First of all, before I begin, I'd just like to thank everybody here who's made my visit to BRAC University possible. First of all, of course, Sir Fazle Abid, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting in Cambridge on a cold February morning for breakfast. Over scrambled eggs, we hatched plans of a visit to Bangladesh, where I might talk about the possibilities of collaborating, building up a collaboration between Cambridge and BRAC University. And this is, I hope, the first step in a series of interactions between our two institutions. I'd also like to thank your very dynamic Vice-Chancellor, Professor Andalib. I'd like to thank the Chair, Manzoor Islam. Also two people who can't be here but who had a big hand in enabling my visit, Dr. Samia Haq and Lina Siddiqui, who are away but have done a great deal to make my visit possible and pleasant. And to Wahidur Zaman and Ali Salman in the communications department, who've been absolutely amazingly brilliant. I can see that the world-renowned efficiency of BRAC has rubbed off tremendously on BRAC University, and you are an amazing organization. I think Cambridge administration should come here and learn a few things from you, rather than the other way around. And I also want to thank all of you here for giving me such a warm and enthusiastic welcome. It feels like coming home, even though it's not really home because of divided Bengal. It's a long time ago when I wrote that book, for which I'm best known in this part of the world, Bengal Divided. But the Vice-Chancellor asked me to say a few words to try and link the subject of today's discussion, which is being stuck, which perhaps seems quite remote from the subject of that book. But I'm just going to try and say a bit about my journey as a scholar, which got me to the point about thinking about being stuck. It follows quite organically from the work that I was doing. As I understand it, and as I understood it then, Bengal Divided was a book about the very complex process of minority formation that occurred throughout South Asia, really from the turn of the 20th century onwards. And it's a process that has continued, unabated, with growing complexity right until this day. I talked in that book about the ways in which some Hindus in Bengal in the early 1920s and 30s began to perceive themselves as a minority, an embattled minority in need of certain protection, perceiving themselves as being unable to achieve full citizenship in unless certain kinds of political arrangements were made for them. And the political arrangement that they eventually chose to go for was partition, because they felt only with a state of their own would they be able to achieve something like citizenship. But the story of minority formation did not end with partition. If anything, it began all over again, even for those West Bengal Hindus who drove through the partition demand, because then they very quickly found themselves to be minorities inside a very different kind of India than the one that they had imagined. And also, they created with that partition, or that partition created a whole new series of groups of people who began to perceive themselves and organize themselves as minorities. And so this has been a problem that has preoccupied me for quite a substantial period of time. Now, of course, one way in which minorities responded to their predicament after 1947 was migration. They responded by choosing or trying or seeking to become refugees in another nation state which they felt would offer them greater dignity and greater protection and greater opportunities for seeking secure means of livelihood. But there were certain people who could not do this. These are the people I describe as the people who became stuck. And I encountered some of these people in the course of a major research project which I was engaged in, have been engaged in for the past 10 years, and which has produced or culminated in a new book which is called the Bengal Diaspora, Rethinking Muslim Migration, which should be out soon. And this talk basically draws upon some of the ideas I developed in that book. This being BRAC University, I thought it might be interesting for you to hear about how my common, my familiar story about minority formation connects to perhaps my less familiar voice as a historian of poverty in its myriad forms. So that's what this paper is really about. It's about how different kinds of social and economic process interweave with the process of minority formation to create a radical new kind of poverty in the late 20th century, which is radical immobility. And that's basically what I'm going to try and present to you here today. So I'm going to read in an attempt to keep to time. I know it's always a bit more boring to read, which is why I've got a few pictures to show you. This paper's subject, immobility, which is, if you like, the opposite side of migration, is a subject that has almost never been studied systematically before. I came across it myself via an interest in it, in the opposite, via an interest in migration, but also by a series of accidents. Some years ago, I happened to be working in the police archives in what was Theatre Road, Shakespeare Shorney in Calcutta. And I came across a story in an old, about a fracas, as they like to describe it, a sort of minor kind of fisticuffs, at a Muslim graveyard in Calcutta in the early 1950s, where soon after partition, Hindu refugees had apparently seized land from Muslims and prevented burials from taking place. Now, I was very curious about this story because it struck me as extraordinary that somebody could seize a graveyard, a cemetery. Anyway, out of curiosity, I tried to find this graveyard. I got into an auto rickshaw and I sort of tried to trace where this place was. Remember, I'm talking about the 1980s, and the graveyard was there in 1950. I tried to find it. It turned out to be almost impossible. The locality where the graveyard had existed, I went round and round asking all kinds of people. That it had now become a very bustling Hindu neighborhood, and they all claimed, some of them quite aggressively, that no such graveyard had ever existed in that locality. But I said, I think it did because it says so, and I persisted in my quest, and finally I came across a very elderly Muslim rickshaw puller. And he said, yes, Didi, there was a graveyard, I'll take you, come with me. And then he took me on this, down these alleys, and then eventually down a road. This is in the heart of Calcutta. Down a road which was so narrow that only two people at the most could pass alongside each other. It was nothing more than a dirt track. It was it was sodden with rain. And finally, after the end of this dirt track, there was this neighborhood which appeared to me as though time had passed it by. I spoke to the people there, and there was the Mutawali, who the custodian of the shrines, and some members of his extended family, perhaps about 24 people remaining out of a community of what had been perhaps 400 or 500 people 30, 40 years ago. And the rest of the people seemed to have vanished. And so anyway, at that time I wrote an article, it was called On Graveyards and Ghettos, and I focused on the problem of ghettoization, because this was obviously clearly an example of the process of ghettoization. But the problem stuck in my head, because what struck me about this small, isolated pocket of Muslims in the heart of Calcutta was their absolutely abject poverty. I had literally in my life, having grown up in a very poor country, never seen anything like it before. I don't want to describe it in too much detail here, but I think you can perhaps imagine it for yourselves. So when I was working in subsequent decades on the problem of migration, I kept again and again coming across people like this, people or communities, small communities like this, like the Mutawali. As I worked on migrants, I kept encountering their counterparts, people whom I began to call stayers-on. They were quiet people like the Mutawali, people who had gone nowhere, people whose stories began to haunt me. They were not folk who had stayed on in peaceful places in times of plenty. Rather, they had remained where they were despite violence, hardship, and social boycott, and being culturally and politically marginalized. They had stayed on while most others like them had fled in contexts of mass migration, where the push factors for migration could hardly have been more compelling. As a handful of scholars are beginning to recognize, immobility raises profound and awkward questions for theorists of migration. Every dominant theory of migration seeks to account for why individuals or households develop migration strategies, how streams of migration arise, and how these are sustained over time. From the standpoint of these theories, migration is unusual behavior, behavior that requires explanation. Its obverse, staying in place, is seen as the norm, an obvious state of affairs that requires no explication. Yet assumptions about the normality of immobility are deeply insecure. In South Asian history, as we recognize, until 1800, as David Loudon and others have showed, perhaps half the adult population was on the move. That's 50% of the adult population was on the move for the majority of their adult lives. Between 1772 in China, in Sichuan, its polyglot society, 60% of the people were habitual migrants. Even in sedentary agricultural societies, as geographers recognize, people are normally engaged in various forms of spatial mobility. Yet despite the growing evidence that immobility is less obviously the norm than was once assumed, few have begun to ask questions about its causes, conditions, and histories. Where such questions have been raised at all, the focus has been upon barriers built by the West against south to north migration. South to north meaning the countries of the south going to the countries of the global north. Jorgen Carling, for instance, has described what he calls the immigration interface faced by migrants, which he sees as a dense jungle in which various paths are associated with specific obstacles, costs, and risks. As these costs and risks escalate, he argues, the phenomenon of involuntary immobility has grown. But Carling's valuable study and the few others that consider the phenomenon focus tightly on migration from the developing world to Western industrial societies. Yet, this focus is problematic. Most of the world's migrants and over 95% of the refugees in the age of migration have not moved to the West. They have moved within the global South, remaining within or close to the regions from which they originated. The South is not just a source of migration, it is its preeminent destination. Once this fact has been recognized, the immobility paradox assumes a quite different complexion. In the global South, the capacity of states to seal their borders is notoriously weak. The costs, whether material or psychic, of migrating across them is comparatively low. In the post-colonial period, in context of nation and minority formation, the pressures to migrate have been intense, particularly for those belonging to national minorities. People like the Mutavli and his family, and others whose story I will mention here today, often feared for their lives. They represent extreme cases who, according to all existing theories of migration, should have left, and yet they stayed on. Why did they remain? And why did this choice, if indeed it was a choice, drive them into poverty? This paper hints at some preliminary answers to these questions. Its conclusions have come out of a multidisciplinary study of the Greater Bengal region. By Greater Bengal region, I mean the region that was included in the province of Bengal at its greatest height in the late 19th century, and the patterns of mobility and immobility within it. The tools deployed in the research included those of a historian and of a historical ethnographer. So in addition to archival research, this paper is based on 160 interviews conducted with both migrants and stayers-on in India and Bangladesh. I'm going to begin by saying something about Bengal's insertion into the global economy in the colonial era and its varying impact for people, which in turn had a profound bearing on their capacity to move after the end of empire. Next, I will identify what I call deficits at macro, micro, and cumulative levels, each of which worked to inhibit the mobility of certain groups and individuals. I also talk about overabundances of obligations to people and places which tied certain kinds of people down. Finally, I will suggest why and in what ways stayers-on have grown poorer. The first section is about grids, bottlenecks, and the development of network poverty. It's a broadly historical section, so those of you who are sort of impatient with history, please bear with me.